All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you all to the Museum of the Albemarle for today's History for Lunch presentation. For those of y'all who are here in the auditorium, we just ask that you please mute your cell phones. And those of y'all on Zoom, please mute your microphone and use the chat for your questions. We will have a Q&A session for everyone at the end of the lecture. Also, a quick thank you to the Friends of the Museum of the Albemarle for their continued support in assisting with our educational programs. If you're interested in becoming a member, you can pick up an application at the front desk. That's also where we have copies of our latest program calendar. So this runs through April. This will also give you some info about our next History for Lunch that's scheduled for Wednesday, February 5th at noon. So just next Wednesday, we'll have Dr. Glenn Bowman, who's a professor at Elizabeth City State University. He's going to discuss the history of efforts in the region to restrict voting rights as well as to expand suffrage from the Jim Crow era all the way up to about the mid-20th century. So we hope that you will join us for his lecture on February 5th. Now today we welcome the Reverend Daniel Cenci of Christ Episcopal Church here in Elizabeth City to discuss the church's history and legacy leading up to the archaeological work that was done last year. So please join us in welcoming our guest speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. The title of this lecture is Kings, Colonists, and Christ Church, the Lasting Legacy of the Church of England in Pasquotank County. So that's a lot. That's a mouthful. We're going to talk a little bit about the Church of England first. A lot of times when we think about American history, we think that it starts in 1776. But here in Eastern North Carolina, we were under the British Crown for nearly 200 years before the War of Independence from England. So there was a long period of time in which England had influence over this land on which we're currently sitting. So the Church of England, what is the Church of England? It goes back to 1534 with the Act of Supremacy, which was an act that was passed by the English Parliament, declaring the King of England at the time, King Henry VIII, as the supreme head of the Church of England. This was part of the Protestant Reformation, through which the Church of England split off of the Roman Catholic Church. Over the next several decades, through the 1530s and 1540s and 1550s, the Church of England struggled with its identity as to how Protestant they were versus how Roman Catholic they were. We finally, by 1559, get what's called the Elizabethan settlement. By this point, Henry VIII's daughter, Elizabeth I, is the Queen of England, and she comes up with what's considered a compromise settlement, a church that theologically is quite Reformed or even Calvinist, but liturgically is very traditional and looks very Catholic. So the Catholic liturgy with the Reformed doctrine. That will become the established church throughout the realm of all England. So what does that have to do with us here in Pasquotank County? Well, let's start at the beginning. In the year 1585, Sir Walter Raleigh was charged with the responsibility of chartering a new colony in Virginia, in what was called Virginia, named for Queen Elizabeth I, who was never married and considered the Virgin Queen. So that's where the name Virginia comes from. This first colony was established on Roanoke Island. We're all familiar with it, just across the sound from us today. Part of the established charter of the island, the purpose of the colony, was to, quote, spread the Christian gospel to the ends of the earth, which this was the ends of the earth in 1585. So part of that purpose was to bring Christianity here to the New World. And of course, the established faith of the Roanoke colony was the Church of England. It would be through the practices of the Church of England that the first baptisms here on British American soil would take place. Those baptisms would be first the Native American guide Manteo, who was baptized on August the 18th, 1587, and the granddaughter of the governor of the colony, the Governor John White, Virginia Dare, and she was baptized at that same time. They were baptized according to the use of the Book of Common Prayer, 1559. And the scriptures that they used at that time were the Great Bible of Henry VIII. Why not the King James Bible? It had not been translated yet. So this was before the production of the King James Bible. That would not be until 1611. So the Great Bible of Henry VIII. We all know the story of the lost colony. By 1590, the colony disappeared, ne'er to be heard from again. A few years later, by 1607, we get the first lasting English colony, which is the Jamestown colony. The Jamestown colony was founded by John Smith and Christopher Newport. And the reason, other than the spread of the Christian religion, at this time, England was in competition with Spain. And the Spanish had already established several colonies in the Caribbean and in what is today Florida. And so the British didn't want to be outdone. So they tried to found their own colonies along the North American seaboard. So the Jamestown colony was founded in 1607. And again, one of the stated purposes in the colonial charter was, quote, the spread of the Christian religion unto the heathen. That's referring, of course, to the Native American people at the time. Settlements were then spread out from Jamestown throughout the rest of the 17th century. And with these settlements went the established church, which was the Church of England. They were extremely devout at this time. One of the early governors of Jamestown was the governor, Lord De La Warr, for whom the state of Delaware is now named. And he was a devout Anglican. And he demanded that all of the residents of the colony attend church services at least twice a day, and listening to sermons at least twice a week. So it was a very devout time period to live in Jamestown. As Jamestown spread out, they began moving north up into what's now the Northern Neck region of Virginia, and also south into what would be Virginia Beach, later Nansemond County, and even down into what's present day North Carolina. In 1629, a patent was granted by the Crown to separate the southern part of the Virginia colony, which extended from present day about Virginia Beach all the way down to Florida, declaring it as the Carolina, Carolona, the Carolina province. This was in 1629. Unfortunately, shortly thereafter, England went to war with itself. You have the English Civil War, and this patent was never fully developed. The purpose, however, in that 1629 patent was that the land would be developed by members of the Church of England, so that they would then spread the faith down into the southern regions of what had been the Virginia colony. But this was stopped because of the English Civil War. We later get the first lasting settlements that would be here in eastern North Carolina. In 1653, there were settlements that were established between the Dismal Swamp in the north and the Chowan and Roanoke River to the west. These were called the Albemarle settlements. We are in the museum of the Albemarle today. This was once known as Albemarle County. These settlements, again, were established for the purpose of members of the Church of England coming down into the, and I've not been following my slides. I'm sorry about that. That's our Roanoke colony picture. This is the baptism of Virginia Dare, one of the depictions of the baptism of Virginia Dare. And here we have the establishment of the Carolina colonies. So the Albemarle settlements. Many people came from Virginia down into North Carolina during this time period. However, it was mostly people who weren't welcomed in Virginia. So who might that be but religious dissenters? A large number of Quakers came into what would be the Albemarle region of this area. And very few members of the Church of England actually wanted to come down here. It was considered the frontier. This was the wilderness. It was dangerous to be down here. Later on, we get a formal establishment of the province of Carolina. This was in 1663. This is the formal separation of Virginia from what would become North and South Carolina. This extends again from Virginia all the way down to Florida. This province was granted to 8 Lord Proprietors of England. These were 8 gentry, members of the gentry in England, who had leadership or authority over the development of this property, over the establishment of colonies and towns and villages. The first General Assembly of the colony or the province of Carolina met here in what would become Pasquotank County at Halls Creek near Nixonton. North and South Carolina would not actually be separated from one another until several years later in 1712. Now, the Church of England would still have a presence, even though there were all these Quakers running around down here, they would still have a presence in this area. And in 1668, the first known services were conducted in what is now Pasquotank County. There was a priest that came down from Virginia by the name of John Wood, and he began conducting divine services, which is Holy Communion, either at a chapel that is completely unknown to history, or in his home, which was located near Knobs Creek, if you know where the golf course is, somewhere along that Knobs Creek. And that's right here in present-day Elizabeth City. The Church of England continued to grow little by little, although there would be continued struggles between the members of the Church of England, which was the established faith up in Virginia, and the primarily Quaker majority that was down here in the Carolina colony. As time went on, more and more folks from Virginia, more and more members of the Church of England began to move down into the Carolina colonies, though, and that number began to balance itself out as to how many Quakers there were versus how many Anglicans there were, particularly here in Pasquotank County. In the year 1694, a deputy governor was appointed to the northern section of the colony. Now, at this point, again, North and South Carolina are one colony. And so the seat of the colony at that point was in Charleston, which means that we're a really long way off. So they appointed a deputy governor to oversee the northern part of the colony, and they established some of their own, I guess, their own colonial representation as well. So a man by the name of John Archidale was appointed as the deputy governor of the northern section of the colony. The interesting thing about John Archidale is that he was a Quaker. So one of the problems at that time is in order to hold office in any of the colonies of the realm, you had to take an oath to the monarch of England, that you would be obedient to the laws of England, but also to the crown. One of the tenets of Quakerism was that you should not swear oaths. So they overlooked that qualification during this time period and allowed many Quakers to take prominent public office positions throughout the Carolina colony, particularly up here in the northern part of the colony, which would eventually become North Carolina. Now that would not last long. In 1699, a new governor was appointed to the colony. This was Henderson Walker. Governor Walker was a devout Anglican, and he thought this was a terrible problem that the Quakers had so much power here in North Carolina. So he decided that he would take it upon himself to see that the true established church would return to its influence in the colony. So he convinced the colonial legislature to pass what was called the Vestry Act of 1701. By the way, Governor Walker is buried in the churchyard of St. Paul's in Edenton. You can actually go visit his grave today. But he convinced the General Assembly of the colony to pass the Vestry Act of 1701. This was approved by then King James II of England. What did the Vestry Act do? Well, first and foremost, like Virginia, it established the Church of England as the official religion of the colony. It mandated that anyone who served public office in the colony had to swear an oath to the crown. Therefore, that seemed to cut out all of our Quaker friends who were not comfortable because of religious conviction, swearing oaths to the crown. In addition to this, the colonial government had the authority to levy taxes against the populace for the support of the established church. What they did was establish different precincts, also known as parishes. Now, you can see the earliest parishes actually date before the earliest precincts date before the 1701 Vestry Act. Those would be declared parishes in 1701, though. So what is a parish? A parish is a geographical region. A lot of times today, when we hear the word parish, we think of a church structure and the people that belong to that parish. But in the colonial period, a parish was a whole region. So the Pasquotank parish was the Pasquotank precinct, that whole geographical region that would become Pasquotank. And in fact, in the colonial era, it was Camden and Pasquotank. That Camden was part of Pasquotank County at that time, and that was considered the Pasquotank parish. So the 1701 Vestry Act established 4 geographical parishes or precincts in the colony, those being Pasquotank, Perquimans, Chowan, and Currituck. Each of these parishes was to have a parish church or a chapel erected somewhere within the geographical bounds of the parish, a parsonage built, which is the home in which a priest can live, and then a glebe established as well. A colonial glebe was a land grant from the crown to the priest. And it was the property on which the priest would live and which the priest could farm and make a living for themselves while they served the parish that surrounded them. Interestingly enough, one of the colonial glebes is quite famous. There is a church in New York City called Trinity Church on Wall Street. And the colonial glebe was 40 acres of lower Manhattan. Their vestry had the smart idea of never selling off any of it. They still own lower Manhattan and collect all of the rent off of all of the buildings in what was the colonial glebe of lower Manhattan. It's the one of the largest endowments of any religious institution in the world. They use a lot of those monies to fund missions overseas and do lots of good work. But it's one way in which that colonial glebe comes into play even still today. The vestries within each parish was appointed a vestry. This is a 12-member group that oversaw the functioning of the parish. Now, we still have a 12-member vestry at Christ Church today, but they will be glad to know that they don't have to uphold all of the duties that their forebears had to uphold. In the colonial era, the vestries oversaw the maintenance of the roads within the parish, the establishment of the schools, the upkeep of all public lands. They were the ones who were to distribute alms unto the poor, and they had authority over the spiritual vitality of the people, and even oversight over judicial matters within the parish. Can you imagine having that much responsibility as a church vestry member? So each of these parishes had a vestry. Now, the problem with the Vestry Act of 1701 is that although it established parishes, set out glebes, and really set up for the formation of a really strong presence of the Church of England in the northern part of North Carolina, unfortunately, there weren't a lot of priests that wanted to come and fulfill the duties within these parishes. North Carolina at the time was considered the wild frontier. It was very dangerous to live down here. There was the constant attacks from Native Americans. There was disease, which came from the mosquitoes in the many swamps in this area, extreme heat in the summer, cold in the winter, difficult terrain to traverse. It was not a place that people really wanted to come. So they had a hard time recruiting members of the clergy to leave their cushy positions in the Caribbean to come here and serve in North Carolina. Luckily, God's providence had plans for us, and there was a young man from the Caribbean, I believe from Barbados, by the name of Charles Griffin, who came to serve in the parish of Pasquotank in 1705. He was not a priest, he was never ordained. The reason being that to be ordained in the Church of England, you had to be ordained by a bishop. And there were no bishops anywhere in any of the British colonies. The Bishop of London had jurisdiction over all of the British colonies from the Caribbean all the way up to what's now Canada. And so if you wanted to be ordained, you had to travel back to London, appeal to the Bishop of London, go through the process of ordination, then be ordained, then be sent back across the ocean to the colonies to serve. So Charles Griffin came from the Caribbean, but was never ordained as a priest, but served as what would be considered a lay minister within the Church of England. He established a school. This would be the first public school in North Carolina, over by the old middle school where the apartments are now. There's a plaque dedicated to him that references his work as establishing the first public school in North Carolina. He's well known because in his school, it was open to everyone, not just to members of the Church of England, but it was also open to the Quakers, to Presbyterians, which at this time, those were really the only groups that were around: Quakers, Presbyterians, and Anglicans. He would later go on to found a school for Native Americans back up in Virginia after he left North Carolina. He conducted worship services in homes. He was not able to do divine services, which is the sacraments of Holy Communion, but he did lead morning prayer and most likely preached sermons to his congregation. And his school was located down along Simmons Creek, which is near present-day Nixonton. And you can see a rough drawing of that school. I'm not sure how accurate that is, but from 1706. Let's see here. Replacing him in 1703, another priest came. This time we finally did get a priest, Reverend John Blair, who was sent from the Society of the Propagation of the Gospel. So in the early 1700s, we have all these parishes being formed in Virginia and in the Carolinas and in the Caribbean and all these places that the British have a footprint, and no one wants to go to them to serve these churches. The priests in England are like, well, I'm happy in my nice parish church here in York. And so they form the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, which is a missionary society that continues to be active today. And they would assign clergy to go to specific places to fulfill the duties. So the Reverend John Blair was the first priest sent down here in 1703. He was replaced by the Reverend James Adams in 1708, and he presided over the parishes of both Pasquotank and Currituck. So imagine everything from western Pasquotank County all the way out to the Currituck Sound, that one person had authority over all of that. He reported in 1708 that 900 of the 1,330 people of the Pasquotank parish, which included everyone in the parish, were members of the Church of England. And he said that the rest were Quakers and, quote, a smattering of Presbyterians and about 200 enslaved Africans. So that was what made up what is now Pasquotank County at that time. By 1715, the vestry of the Pasquotank parish had built two churches, one called St. Peter's, which is up near present-day South Mills, which is in present-day Camden County, and one called St. John's, which is down near Weeksville. Now, do not confuse that with the St. John's in Weeksville that everyone has a picture of decaying on their walls in their house. That was much later built as a mission of Christ Church in Elizabeth City, but it is built probably near where the original St. John's Parish Church was, down near Weeksville. And it is probably, I'm using those words carefully, probably called St. John's in honor of the former St. John's that was there in the colonial era. My home church in Edgecombe County is St. Mary's in Speed, and it was a 19th century mission church, but it was built near the location of the original Edgecombe Parish Church, which was called St. Mary's back in the colonial era. So it was common to rename these missions after the original colonial colonial parishes. But the one down in lower Pasquotank County was called St. John's, although the location of both of these parishes is unknown, or both of these church buildings is unknown. All right, let's get into the good stuff. So we have all these Quakers and we have all these Anglicans up here. And the Anglicans don't want the Quakers controlling things, and the Quakers don't want the Anglicans controlling things. So what happens? Well, following Governor Walker's appointment in 1699, we find that a two-party system emerges in the province, in the North Carolina province. And these two parties are the Church Party, which is the party that favors the established church, the Church of England, also known as Anglicanism, and the Quaker Party, which is the party that favors the Quakerism, the Quakers and Quakerism. Now, again, remember that Quakers could not hold office at this time because they would not swear oaths to the crown. Now, in 1705, a man by the name of Thomas Carey was appointed as the deputy governor of the Albemarle. So this is, again, the northern part of the Carolina province. Thomas Carey is appointed as governor up here, and he initially supports the Church Party, so the Anglican Party. Well, the Quakers, seeing that now we have yet another governor who doesn't want us to have any power in the colony, get mad. And so they start trying to have the governor removed from office. And they write to the Lord Proprietors back in England, and they say, look, things aren't fair down here. We're religious dissenters, but we're British citizens, and we want to be treated equally. So will you please remove Thomas Carey from power? And the Lord Proprietors do as they wish. And they replace him with a governor named William Glover, who's actually even more Anglican than Thomas Carey was, and makes things even worse for the poor Quakers here in northeastern North Carolina. With a turn of events, Thomas Carey, who had then been ousted from his seat, decided that he would change parties. He saw the light, and he decided to side with the Quakers in hope of himself being restored to the governorship. He said, well, if you support me, I'll take a little less hard line on y'all. The Quakers agree, and the Quakers are also aligned with other religious dissenters, including Presbyterians and things like that, and even people who have no religious affiliation, which even back then, that was a thing. So in 1708, Thomas Carey and the Quakers are successful in running William Glover out of the colony, and he is restored to power very quickly. He then allows the Quakers to regain control of the North Carolina government of the General Assembly. The Quaker Party will go on to rule the government of this colony until 1711, when the Lord Proprietors get word and they send yet another governor to come in and replace Thomas Carey yet again. This governor's name was Edward Hyde, and his job was to restore the Church Party to power and to put the members of the Church of England back at the helm of the Carolina colony. Obviously, the Quakers and Mr. Carey did not like that, and this resulted in an armed conflict between the two parties. In May of 1711, Thomas Carey fled to a fortified plantation near the city of Bath down in the Pamlico River. The plantation itself was an island surrounded by water. And when you think about the right to bear arms, this plantation was armed with 5 cannons. So it was a fortified plantation. It was a fort in and of itself. Edward Hyde, pursued by seafaring vessel with about 80 troops, and he sailed up to the plantation, and a battle ensued, cannons firing back and forth. There were only 2 cannons on the boat, and there were 5 cannons at the plantation, and the ones on the land won. The mast of the ship was broken, and Edward Hyde sailed off in defeat, and Thomas Carey stayed there on his safe fortified property. However, When the governor of Virginia got word of what was going on, Governor Spotswood of Virginia, remember, Virginia from very early on is controlled by the Church of England, the members of the Church of England. When he received word, he sent a company of Royal Marines sailing under the banner of England to go down and to aid Hyde in arresting Thomas Carey. When these Royal Marines arrived, they saw the banner of the king and realized that if they fired on the king's banner, they would be considered treasonous. And so they surrendered, and Carey was taken back to England in chains. He later was freed and made his way back to Virginia and lived happily ever after. The church party was restored to power in northeastern North Carolina, and Anglicanism once again became the established faith of the colony, and those who wanted to hold office within the colony had to swear an oath to the crown and to the church. The remainder of the 18th century, so throughout the rest of the 1700s, there continued to be tension between the members of the Church of England, the Quakers, and other religious dissenters. Most North Carolina parishes, including the Pasquotank Parish, continued also to struggle to find clergy throughout the colonial period. There seemed to be periodic conflicts that arose between the priests and between the vestries of these parishes. Some of the 18th century clergy lamented that both the physical hardships of living in these swamps, combined with the general lack of spiritual conviction of the laity, rendered the Pasquotank Parish a less than appealing appointment. One early clergyman described the parish as having, quote, the worst of roads. His successor then described the inheritance of the Pasquotank region as being, quote, a lawless and barbarous people, a nest of the most notorious profligates, which I looked that up, that means drunkards, upon the earth, comprised of the dregs and gleanings of all other English colonies. He was not a very pastoral man, was he? Goodness gracious. He did not want to be here, clearly. But to their credit, the vestry members of the Pasquotank Parish had their own criticisms of the clergy that were sent to them by the Society of the Propagation of the Gospel. At one point, the vestry of Pasquotank recorded that, quote, the heavy burden we groan under is the want of a grave, sober, and able divine to be settled among us. In 1725, the governor of the colony, Richard Everard, wrote to the Bishop of London and described the Reverend Thomas Bailey, who was the priest assigned to the Pasquotank parish churches, as being, quote, a scandalous and drunken man from Philadelphia. Some things never change. No, who was likely to break windows and be fighting. He kept himself much disordered in liquor. So obviously there were some issues between the clergy and between the vestry members of the Pasquotank parish. But despite these conflicts, the church continued to survive, and it continued to grow throughout the colonial period. During this time, there were several Anglican chapels that were added to St. John's and St. Peter's, most of which existing in what is today Camden County, which was formed out of Pasquotank in 1777. There is mention of an Isaac Sawyer Chapel in the latter half of the 1700s, which was located in present-day Pasquotank County, perhaps, and may have been in or near what would become Elizabeth City. I'll get to more of that in a bit. Let's move on to the American Revolution. 1776, America goes to war against the British colonies. With the American Revolution comes the disestablishment of the Church of England. Even though, particularly in the South, there were a lot of Anglicans, there was a feel that the Church of England should not be the established church anymore once we separated from England. So the North American Anglicans had to really come to terms with who they wanted to be. One of the problems, there was already a shortage of clergy. There became an even greater shortage of clergy because to be a priest in the Church of England not only did you have to be ordained by a bishop back in London, but you had to take a vow of obedience to the crown. And your vow was that you would uphold the doctrine, discipline, and worship of the church, and that you would be obedient to the one that God had placed upon the crown, the throne of the English realm. So many of the clergy during the American Revolution actually fled the colony. Many went to the Caribbean, some went up to what is now Canada, and some over back to Britain itself. There were a few clergy left after the war, but not nearly enough to oversee all of the parish churches that had been established in the colonies, particularly here in North Carolina. We had some of the least number of clergies of all the colonies. So many of the churches at that point fell into disrepair. Some of them were abandoned completely, and some became Methodist. So I didn't talk much about the Methodists, but by the latter part of the 18th century, the Methodist movement is a movement that begins within the Church of England, and it's part of the second great, or really starts with the first Great Awakening in the early 1700s, and then really comes to fruition in the second Great Awakening, which is the latter part of the 1700s and beginning of the 1800s. After the war, there's no priests left, or very few priests left. We need priests in these Church of England parishes, and the only way to get them is for a priest to go to England and have the bishop lay his hands on them. Now, what do you think would happen if a priest who had been in open rebellion against the crown sailed to London, went up to Canterbury Cathedral or to one of the cathedrals and said, "Will you please ordain me as a clergyman, or ordain this young man that I've raised up as a clergy person?" Of course, they're going to say, "Absolutely no, no chance anyway." The Methodists, on the other hand, felt that clergy could ordain other clergy. So that was one big change. So Methodism would begin to really thrive after the American Revolution because you didn't need the bishops anymore. They still would have bishops, but those bishops didn't need to be consecrated by other bishops, like in the Church of England. So Methodism really grew. Also, the Second Great Awakening placed a large focus on the emotional aspect of your faith, really feeling the conversion experience, really feeling the movement of the Holy Spirit within your life. And the Methodists were much more open to that than sort of the straight-laced Anglicans were in the late 18th century. Another group that really grew during this time would become what is now the most dominant faith in Pasquotank County. What do you think that is? Baptist, exactly. That it's at this time that the Baptist church really begins to grow. And again, very much for the same reasons that Methodism grows, because there is not a requirement for a bishop to lay his hands on the pastor. The local congregation ordains the pastor in the Baptist tradition. So again, those churches really began to grow and thrive, and the Church of England really struggled during the American Revolution period. It would not be until 1785 to 1789, which in those years, in 1785 and in 1789, the few Episcopalians or Church of England priests who were left in the colonies came together and had a convention in which they sought to reorganize and rebrand as the Protestant Episcopal Church. They, again, were not able to make bishops or more priests. So they ended up actually having to go to the Episcopal Church of Scotland to receive consecration for their first bishop, and then they were able to make more priests from there. And so the Episcopal Church was formed. Now, once the Protestant Episcopal Church came into being, there became a notion among some of the founding fathers of our country that perhaps we should have an established faith, and perhaps it should be the Protestant Episcopal Church. You may or may not know this, but 34 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence were Anglicans. And so many of them felt strongly that the problem wasn't the church, the problem was the king. So we can keep the church and ditch the king. George Washington, the first president, actually favored the establishment of the Episcopal Church as the established faith, with the tolerance of other faiths as well. But Thomas Jefferson was adamantly opposed to that, and obviously Jefferson won out and Anglicanism was officially disestablished. In the late 1700s, Anglicans in Pasquotank County continued to worship, however, mostly in homes as those churches became either Methodist or fell into disrepair, or private chapels which were located on various plantations throughout the region. From the 1790s through the early 1800s, again, Methodism and Anabaptism continued to grow rapidly, and the Anglican Church still struggled to find clergy. This brings us to some of the earliest foundations of Christ Church, what's now called Christ Episcopal Church. In 1790, a property was deeded by a man named John Cartwright for the establishment of a Protestant Episcopal Church, the newly founded denomination, on the property that was already considered to be Isaac Sawyer's Chapel, which was founded in 1761. We don't know where that is. Some think that perhaps that was in present-day Camden County. It's been thought that it was located right next to this building where the Episcopal Cemetery is today, or it could have been possibly somewhere else entirely. We really don't know. There's lots of different guesses as to where that first property was. In 1793, the city of Elizabeth City was established. It was originally called Reading. The name was then changed to Elizabethtown in 1794. And then there was already an Elizabethtown down south of Clinton in the southern part of the state. And so they changed the name again to Elizabeth City in 1801. In the early 1800s, divine services and baptisms were continued in the form of the Church of England according to the use of the Book of Common Prayer here in Elizabeth City and throughout Pasquotank County, but they were conducted by the minister of St. Paul's in Edenton. After the Revolutionary War, St. Paul's was one of the few churches that survived and thrived in the time after the Revolution. And so the minister of St. Paul's in Edenton was sent out here to do services at various homes and in small chapels. In 1825, it became clear that there needed to be a church in the new, big, up-and-coming, growing town of Elizabeth City. So those who were worshiping in small chapels and in homes throughout the county decided to consolidate, and Christ Episcopal Church was chartered and founded on All Saints' Day in 1825. This is a picture of the original Christ Episcopal Church that was built sometime between 1825 and 1827, when the property was actually deeded to the vestry. The Reverend John Avery of Edenton was the first pastor of that church. The land on which it sits, where it currently is today, was given by John McMorrin, for whom McMorrin Street is named. And it was originally called Christ's Church, CHRIST', Christ's Church. Now, this is where we get to the archaeological connection. And I can show you another picture. That's what it looks like today. This is where we get to our archaeological connection. The property on which the church sits in the original town plot map were lots 15 and lots 16. These lots were originally owned by a man named Willis Case, or Casey, back in the 1790s when the town was first divided up. In the year 1813, a gentleman named George Davis, who was a prominent African American in the community, purchased those lots. Now, think about how prominent these lots are. Where the area between here and the church, where Ehringhaus Street currently is, it's the parking lot just past Ehringhaus towards the church, was actually an open creek back then that vessels could traverse up and down. So this was waterfront property on which Mr. Davis owned this property. And to have two lots, there were only, I think, about 70 lots in the whole town. So he had a good chunk of Elizabeth City in his ownership. He maintained that property, built a house on it, had a little bit of several outbuildings until the time of his death in 1822. After he died, the property was sold in 1823 to settle some outstanding debts that he and his family had. And then by 1825, Mr. McMorrin had somehow acquired the property, probably bought it at the auction, and gave it to the church to build the new church on. Now, the property that the original church was on, that church, is actually where the parish house is today. So the Sunday school building that's, if you're looking at the front of the church to the left, is where the original church was. And the Davis family house that George Davis built was where the lot is, where the church is, and where the playground lot is today. In 1856, the women of the church, the ECW, the Episcopal Church women had raised $6,000 to construct a new church on the property that was adjacent to where the old church was and where the Davis house once stood. And we don't know exactly when the Davis house was torn down. It may have been right up against the church for quite some time after the church was built, or it may have been torn down afterwards. We're still trying to figure out the history of that property. And that's when the current church, that church was built in 1856. Can you imagine $6,000 to build all of that? Golly, what do you think it would take today to build Christ Church? The original church, parts of it were dismantled and incorporated into the new church. Most specifically, the rose window that's above the altar came out of the 1825 church and is still above the altar in the church today. And also the original pipe organ came out of the 1825 church and is on the balcony of the church today. Once the 1825 church was fully dismantled, a rectory was built on that site, and the rectory remained there until the parish house was built in 1925. And then the rectory was moved back to the lot between the current church and the jewelry store, or what used to be the bus station, back behind the church. Let's see here. This is some of the excavation work. So this site was accidentally discovered last summer. We had a large magnolia tree that had been gifted to the church after World War I in honor of one of our parishioners who perished in the war. But unfortunately, the roots of the magnolia tree got into the sewage pipes of the church, causing a great deal of damage. So the magnolia tree had to be removed. And when the magnolia tree was pulled up, lo and behold, there's the remains of the Davis house down underneath. Lots and lots of artifacts that came out of there. And so we contacted the museum here, the North Carolina Department of Archaeology, and did a lot of the excavating in-house with our own parishioners. And you can see Ian Lowry and Robin Nix. They really headed up the excavation work on the property, doing most of the digging, finding the artifacts, identifying the artifacts, dating the artifacts. And we discovered lots of history of Pasquotank County, going all the way back to the early 1700s. And even before, some Native American artifacts were uncovered as well under the same property. Here you can see just some of the things that the most likely the Davis family owned before the church acquired the property. Some Chinese porcelain from the late 1700s. There's, let's see here, lots of pipes. They were a smoking family, it seems. We found lots and lots of pipes, some different earthenware pottery, lots of glassware, just really interesting things. Some doorknobs and door hinges and things from the home. There was a lot of charring, so there's a theory that perhaps the house burned at some point, and then it was all just pushed into a pile and buried, which would explain why we couldn't really find any outline of the foundations or anything. But some of these items certainly indicate that there may have been a large fire at some point. Let's see here. This is one of the earliest pieces here, an earthen pottery vessel. And then we even found some whole, there's that bottle there is a wine bottle. That is a whole bottle. We found some French imported wine bottles that still have the labels on them from the mid 1700s. So lots of really interesting pieces that kind of give us the glimpse into what life was like during this whole time period, leading up from the early establishment of the Pasquotank Parish all the way up through the building of Christ Church and the foundation of the church itself. This year, we are celebrating our 200th anniversary as Christ Church, and we're very excited about that. And this lecture is part of our celebration of our 200th anniversary. Just to give you an idea of the influence that the members of the vestry of Christ Church have had over the years, I'll read a few names for you: Erringhouse, McMorran, Poole, Fearing, Martin, Harney, Grice. Almost every street downtown that is named for a person was named for a vestry member of Christ Church. So it certainly had a lot of influence. Even Martin Luther King Boulevard used to be Martin Street, which was named for a member of the vestry of Christ Church as well. So a lot of influence in this area, going way, way back to the early 1700s. And we continue to be an active parish today and are excited for what God has in store for the future. With that, I do have a few minutes for questions that I may be able to answer. So thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Or give words, maybe 5 words of Lorton, like the transition to Lorton. What comes to mind for the next 4 years of your family's transition over there?
Yes, so I have announced to the congregation that I've accepted a call to another historic church, the historic Pohick Church in Lorton, Virginia. So hopefully I'll be able to do some similar things to this up there. And I think we ask that all of you pray for me and my family as we transition. I do love history. I love the history of the church, the history not just of the Anglican Church, but of all churches, because I think that our county has been influenced not only by the Church of England, but by so many faiths and so many faith traditions that have been a wonderful blessing to this area. So I hope that this didn't come across too pro-Anglican, although I am an Anglican priest. But I hope to transmit this in a way that is just historically accurate. Any other? Yes, ma'am.
Are they here or are they at the church? Or
The artifacts are being privately kept right now, although we hope to be able to offer a display at the church some point during the 200th anniversary. That I think we're actively looking for some display cabinets and that sort of thing, so we can have those available for people to come in and see. And we are still researching a lot of them as well, the background and the dating and that kind of thing. Certainly. Yes, ma'am.
Church has many written records, don't they, going back how far?
That's debatable. Our earliest church register dates to about 1823, so even before the founding of Christ Church. St. Paul's in Edenton has records of what was happening in Pasquotank County in that period between the American Revolution and now. But that's not we don't have those records. St. Paul's in Edenton has those in their vestry records, because the vestry here was pretty much disbanded at the American Revolution. And then it wasn't reformed until 1825 when Christ Church was founded. So you have a gap in the vestry, the period in which the Pasquotank parish had a vestry. So, yes, ma'am.
The records are kept at the University of Carolina.
That's right. Some of the church records are at East Carolina University as well. Yes. So, yes, ma'am.
St. Peter's, they had a chapel near South.
Near South Mills, that's correct. Mm-hmm.
That is the oldest property that continues used as a place of worship.
Is that McBride Chapel? Yes. Yes. That was actually a separate church from St. Peter's, though, but it is you're probably right that it's the longest. Fork Chapel was founded, I believe, in the 1760s, I think, or 1740s, a little bit after St. Peter's was kind of further up the river a little bit more.
1733.
1730s. Okay. (1733). Okay. Mm-hmm. And that's an example of a church, an Anglican parish that became Methodist after the Revolutionary War. That's right. Yes. Mm-hmm. They petered out. So yeah, Mhm. That's correct. And there was one in Camden as well, in downtown Camden as well. So there were lots of Episcopal churches that kind of started in the early 1800s and grew up in Camden and Pasquotank County. And many of them were small and rural areas, and none of them have survived as Episcopal churches, other than Christ Church in downtown Elizabeth City is the only lasting Episcopal church. But you're correct that there were some up in South Mills and Camden proper, the city of or town of Camden as well. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
There are a couple of pieces of artifacts that were found that predate Elizabeth City's history.
Yes, there were at least 2 Native American artifacts that were found that significantly predate the founding of Elizabeth City. That's correct as well. Which would go back that this area, the Narrows along the Pasquotank River, was used as a trading post by Native Americans, by the early colonists, long before these towns were established. So there was a lot of activity in this area, even before the city of Elizabeth City was established. So yes, some of the artifacts do predate. And it's interesting that you should raise your hand. Vivian Lowry, one of the founding vestry members of the vestry of the Pasquotank Parish way back in 1701 was Robert Lowry. So how about that? And he was in Weeksville, so it's probably some kin to your husband's family. So I imagine that we still have families that are connected to some of these colonial ancestors. In fact, Charles Griffin, who was the first teacher of the school, some of his ancestors are still members of Christ Church today. So we have a lot of connections that go way back.
So I was just curious, you found a lot of artifacts and identifying them, that's an easy task. And I was wondering, what organizations are you working with to provide the expertise and advice and so forth?
So we've worked some with East Carolina University. ECSU has helped with like the ground penetrating radar and finding the location of where artifacts are. In fact, there's another site on the property that's not been excavated that has the potential for excavation in the future that they were able to identify. And then our church historian, Ian Lowry, is working with various different experts in identifying things from all over the country, really. I know that he has a pottery expert in Florida that has helped identify some things. So we've reached out kind of far and wide in trying to identify different pieces. Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions? Well, thank you all very much, and I appreciate your willingness to come and hear about the history. And hope you have a blessed day.